Welcome, everybody, to the second autumn episode of In Conversation with Choices, where we get to the nitty-gritty of various aspects of languages. And today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Joshua Paiz, teacher-educator at Community College of Baltimore County and teaching assistant professor at the George Washington University in the US. Joshua is, I would say, a genuine man of many parts, as he's been involved in many other professional activities as well. And, Joshua, I always make a point of making these guest introductions a bit personal. So here it goes.
All right.
I've had the privilege of collaborating with Joshua on some occasions, and especially one when we worked together on a book I edited 2 years ago, which focused on DEI, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion in education, especially language education. And well, needless to say, this was a great experience, which I remember dearly. So once again, Josh, thanks a lot for agreeing to be part of this project. And I guess this is just a brief, succinct overview of who Joshua is and how he has been navigating his academic career. I do believe that, enumerating all of your achievements and accomplishments wouldn't do justice to what you've accomplished in your professional life. I was wondering, however, what's the most important aspect of your professional journey so far?
I would say these days flexibility. And I think we see this with sort of the reaction in the discipline that we've seen when it comes to the emergence of artificial intelligence, specifically generative artificial intelligence, because we have to be honest that AI has been part of education for decades now, but it's largely been this sort of background sort of process that we haven't really had to worry about. Now with GenAI, it's very in our face, and we've seen sort of three camps emerge: the cautious, we'll wait and see; the reactionary, this is bad, burn it with fire; and then probably the camp that I'm a little bit more in, which is more the tech evangelist of, hey, this is an important tool. So I would say that flexibility has probably been key for me. I would say key for any good educator, good researcher, that sort of sense of curiosity and keeping an open mind about new changes in the discipline.
Absolutely. Being able to adapt your already existing skills and experience and put it to good use, right? Absolutely. Right. So, Joshua, many people have been comparing the invention or development of Gen AI to lots of, I would say, various but surprising things. Some people have compared it to the Industrial Revolution, to the invention of conveyor belts. Some people liken it to calculators, and all of the worry and cries that calculators would basically leave students, brainless and not able to do basic maths on their own, etc., etc. How do you see Gen AI at the moment in terms of opportunities, threats, issues?
Yeah. So I will begin by acknowledging that the sort of AI anxiety that we hear from individuals, that is a perfectly justifiable response to a moment of seemingly profound change, right? I would here just remind individuals that, yes, this feels like a transformative moment because as language educators, we haven't had to keep up with AI technologies in the same way that the AI researcher or the machine learning researcher needs to, right? But this is just one step of steady progress in a decades-long research agenda in computer sciences, right? This dream of generative artificial intelligence is one stepping stone on the way to what's called artificial general intelligence, which is the capability of the machine to basically cognize about the world the way a human being does, right? So this has been coming for quite some time. It's just become very public in the way that OpenAI back in November released ChatGPT to the public and made it freely available. It was no longer something that was just sort of the purview of developers, but now daily users could interact with this thing, and it could do seemingly surprising work, right? Things that for the longest time, when you thought of AI, you would think of things like Skynet from Terminator, to use a disastrous one, or the computer from Star Trek, or C-3PO from Star Wars, right? It was this sort of far off thing, unless it was this sort of background process that worked largely off of things like data analytics, right? That being said, I like I said, I can understand that sort of initial sort of knee-jerk reaction and that anxiety. I think that's perfectly fine, but I would say that this is just like any other step in technological progress, right? Yes, there will be that disruptive moment at the very beginning as we all sort of collectively kind of catch our breath and start thinking about what this means for us as either professionals or as workers or as human beings, especially in the case of things like AI images and AI videos. The implications there for deep fakes and for misinformation is startling, most certainly, right? But just like when we saw automation hit things like the textile industries in, what was that, the late early 1900s, yes, there was this genuine worry about things like labor loss and skill loss, and there has been some of that to certain degrees. But what we've really seen has been shifts in the labor market, right? And the emergence of different classes of skilled labor. And a lot of that has been tied to individuals' ability to engage with automation, which is what something like generative AI is. It's a form of automation. So here I would say, going forward, right, the real opportunity there will be for individuals who can integrate AI tools into their workflows in ways that are ethically sound and that honor their expertise as human beings, right? Using AI as a tool to augment human ability as opposed to a replacement for it, right? I would say that that's the potential there, right? Is AI as a tool to sort of amp up human creativity, to amp up human expertise, right? And if we look at AI as a tool for language teachers, for example, right? In the US, a lot of language teachers exist in a contingent role. So they're either part-time or they're contract and they're facing heavy teaching loads, right? So the pandemic has caused many of us to consider, well, what does work-life balance mean for me, right? How do I deliver outstanding instruction to my students while still respecting my right to exist as a human being and have a full life, right? And there are ways to use generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Google Bard, or Claude Anthropic 2 in ways that support the expertise of the educator and allow them to divest time away from some of those rote administrative tasks, right? Things like weekly emails or daily email updates, right? Divest time away from that while still providing that service to learners or to parents if you work in a K-12 setting, right? So that you, the educator, can focus more on what really matters and what the AI can't replace, which is that human interaction between teacher and student. And it is that human interaction between teacher and student that is so facilitative to the learning process, right? The other question that you asked.
Can I pick up on one of the words that you used here related to feelings, the feeling of anxiety, being anxious, right? I guess that the introduction of Gen AI has caused a major paradigm shift when it comes to thinking about jobs, how we perform our jobs, how those jobs can be augmented by the tools that are becoming freely available to us. And so I guess that many teachers have been asking themselves the question, like, will we be required in the future, or is Gen AI going to do the entire job for us? Where do you stand here?
I don't think it can do the entire job for us. I think it can do some surprising things, I'm not going to lie. As I was getting ready for our talk today, I actually fed some questions into ChatGPT because the new model GPT-4 has the voice option now, right? The text to speech. So you can talk to it just like you can talk to a human being. And I had primed it to be in the podcast host, right? And it behaved just like an NPR style podcast host was, asking me questions, evaluating my responses, right? Thinking of follow-up questions based on my responses
for the event.
in preparation for today's event, right? We're both human beings, I promise. And it was rather surprising how naturalistic that conversation was, right? But it still required me, the human being, to create the encounter, right? I still had to set the context for the system. I had to tell it what its goals was. I had to give it the questions, and it was just fulfilling a role, right?
Right.
So in this regard, the system itself isn't agentive, right? It can't create the instructional encounter. It can, however, support it with proper priming from the user, right? So in my case, I had to spend a solid 5 minutes or so engaging in that act of prompt engineering of saying, hey, you know what? I'm getting ready for this podcast. Here are some of the questions that I might be asked. Here's who I am, right, as the guest. Here's who you are as the host. Here's the persona that I want you to take on. And now I'd like you to ask me the questions and act as the host, right? But that still required me, the human being, to create that context for the system, right?
Yeah.
So
but it did speed up the process of getting prepared.
It did. Because now I wasn't just kind of
a human being, that would take ages, right?
It could, right? Like if I had never done a podcast before, or if I've never sat for an interview before, it might be difficult for me to come up with those questions that somebody might ask in a setting like this, right? So it can certainly facilitate that, right? The other thing here then is I don't have to rely on access to a colleague, right, to run through these ideas with me, because we're both busy people and that might not be a reality, right? So the tool was available when I had time, as opposed to me having to carve out time in a calendar to interact with a colleague, which in this regard then was a good sort of stand-in for that, right? And I would say that this is, again, as we're thinking about AI as a tool to support learners or to support teachers, right? We come back to this idea of sort of the democratization of education, right? Where if we have high-powered language models like GPT 3.5 or like Palm 2, which is what powers Google Bard, and it's freely available to the public, right? If we can, instill both our learners and our educators with this sort of critical AI literacy about how to use these tools effectively to support their learning, right? Well, then now if a student is in need of help at 11 o'clock at night, which they often are, if you've ever done any teaching, you've gotten those panicked emails, right? As the educator, you want to help, but you as a human being shouldn't have to be on 24/7, 365, right? And universities, because I work in higher ed, have done different things to try to support learners in their time of need, like having late night study sessions or academic support centers, right? But even then, this is oftentimes high cost. It may be inaccessible because it's in a particular part of the campus, right? And AI can be used to help fill that gap for some students. Right? The other nice thing about this is that it can also be used to help support neurodiverse learners, right? We all know that teaching is a multivariate problem, and it's difficult for any educator, no matter how many years of experience, to be able to address all needs and all concerns, or even to be aware of them all, right? Here we can think of an AI tool like ChatGPT 4, which is a more powerful version of the GPT model, right, as a partner with the teacher to help them come up with ways to meet the needs of these students, right? And that can be really profound in how it can support student learning and success.
Absolutely. Would you advocate that the ways in which we use Gen AI should be part and parcel of modern day curricula in terms of teacher education?
I think it needs to be, right? Just like we've seen EdTech begin to permeate into teacher education, right? So like when I did my master's in ESL all the way back in 2009, there was the option to take a class in educational technology. It wasn't required, however, right? And that was really when we were starting to see the emergence of things like MOOCs, the multi-online user courses. We started to see CMSs, content management systems like Blackboard and Moodle start to take off in a much more sort of endemic sort of way, right? However, now I do teacher education at the Community College of Baltimore County and at Montgomery College, so 2 local community colleges. And in both of these, EdTech is baked into every step of the teacher education curriculum, right? So now EdTech is part of principles, right? The teaching principles class. Now it is part of materials design. Now it is part of classroom management and instruction, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say AI is going to be, especially generative AI, is going to become the next piece of that sort of puzzle then, right? Because it is another potential tool in the quiver of the educator. And even in places like, I think it was New York City schools, when Gen AI first kind of exploded last fall, last winter, right, took the approach of banning the tool outright. Even if we ban access to a tool, students are going to use it if they find it helpful, right? So from my perspective, better that we equip those students with the habits of mind and the critical literacy needed to engage with the tool ethically, which then means we have to prepare the educator to understand that tool, how they can use it as an educator, and how their students can use it effectively. Right? Because the way that the expert educator and the way that the student engage with AI is slightly different, right? They have different needs, and they have different ways of prompting the system to get what they need out of it.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that you've raised a crucial question about the use of Gen AI in education, that is ethics. How do we ensure that that ethics is there in the process of educating, at which level of education? What I mean in particular is, like, how do we ensure that students, for instance, don't do what they used to do with, for instance, Wikipedia? That is, like, when I was supposed to, for instance, write an essay, if I was unethical, I would most probably copy and paste bits and pieces of what I get from Wikipedia. How do we make our students ethical in the use of Gen AI when it comes to out-of-class assignments?
Yeah, so I would say there it begins with the educators starting to understand a little bit more critically about why students engage in less ethical practices, right? So what you're describing there is what some in second language writing and in rhetoric and composition would call sort of textbook plagiarism. Some would call it patch writing, which is an important sort of tertiary step or intermediate step as we go from novice to expert writers, right? So oftentimes when we look at the research into things like plagiarism and academic integrity violations, oftentimes this has some external component to the student. It's not that students are inherently evil, right? It's not that they want to engage in the act of deception or cheating, but there may be, for example, if we were looking at a student learning how to program, for example, they may have grown up being told, hey, you suck at programming, you're not a math student, you're not a STEM student. And so now if they're taking this, let's say, introductory Python class, they may already be starting at a disadvantage of this affective state of, I am not X, right? And so then when they face these moments of profound challenge and struggle, which is a legitimate part of the learning process, right? They may feel the need for additional support, or they may feel a threat to themselves as good student and may then engage in less ethical behavior, right? Another reason that we see students reporting that they rely on or that they violate norms of academic integrity or academic honesty is because they feel time crunch, right? They're taking 3, 4, 5 classes. All of these classes have intense workloads. And then at the end of the day, the work has to get done. Right? This doesn't necessarily justify any of this, but it does help us understand why students are doing what they're doing. Right? And once we understand this, then we as educators or as educational administrators can start to make systematic changes to help support the learners, right? So if this is a case where students were, you give the example of, going to Wikipedia and sort of patch writing, right? Well, if this can be tied to the student's sort of affective state of, I'm a bad writer, therefore I must do this because I have to pass this class. Well, how can we then instead create space in our classes for students to engage with AI tools? How can we as educators model their ethical use, right? And this includes things like being transparent about the AI tools that we as writers use, how we use them, and the impact that they have on our writing, right? How can we model this use for our students in a way that encourages them over time to engage in this more ethical behavior, right? One of the things that we've seen in writing centers since the emergence of Gen AI is some students are resistant to talking about their use of AI tools because they're afraid that they're going to be judged. Right? and that they're going to be judged negatively or be judged as deficient writers or as deficient students, right? So part of it then becomes tackling this sort of mindset of saying, hey, you know what? If you need to use this tool or if you want to use this tool, that's fine. But here are the set of practices that we as a discipline or we as an organization value. So if you're going to use the tool, this is the manner in which we feel that you should use this to support your learning and to support your emerging expertise. Right? So that's what I would say there, is that it requires sort of this institutional approach of saying, this is what this kind of practice looks like, right? This is what it looks like to incorporate this tool, and creating space for students then to engage and play with this tool use in a way where they still find their own voice and are still agentive in that process.
Yeah. Speaking of writing, Joshua, you've been working on a book project for some time now, right? On the use of Gen AI in education. So here, well, spoiler alert, it's going to be a provocative question. Have you been ethical writing your book? And what's the role that Gen AI played in writing the book?
Yeah. So the title of the book is going to be Collaborative AI, Artificial Intelligence Expertise and Pedagogy in English Language Teaching. I'm working on this with Equinox UK, which is an independent academic publisher up there. And I've always been the kind of person who does their best to live their values. So if I'm going to make a recommendation to an educator, I'm going to try to do that thing in my own professional practice, right? And when it comes to, again, going back to that question of AI ethics, right, and how we use these tools ethically, for me, this means two things. One, a human being always has to be in the loop, right? So a human has to be part of that sort of feedback cycle between the human being and the AI agent. This isn't just prompt the AI, copy paste the output, right? This is interrogating and problematizing that output, right? But then also transparency, right? So if we're going to use AI tools to support our workflow, then being honest with our interlocutors or our readers, whomever, with that, right? So one of the ways that I use AI to support my own writing process is as a sort of thinking buddy, right? So I mentioned earlier, at GW, I'm in a small program. There are 4 full-time EAP professors. We're all teaching 3 or 4 classes a semester, so we never see each other, right? So it can be really hard to find time to engage with my colleagues and to think through my ideas, right? So this is something that I've been using AI as a sort of ersatz colleague of, I give it this sort of contextual prompt of, hey, this is who I am, this is the project I'm working on, and this is who you are. You're going to be my sort of tech-averse colleague, right? You're an expert in English language teaching, but you're kind of, you have kind of a negative view of the role of artificial intelligence. So I want you to be a sparring partner with me, right? And I'll put one of my ideas into it and it will push back. And then I find myself having this sort of argument over text with the AI. And it's been a really useful tool for me to think through some of my ideas. It's also been useful for gaining perspective, right? Because we're all of us new to artificial intelligence in different ways, and so it's been helpful for me to be able to engage with AI tools to find blind spots, right? So as a higher ed person, a lot of my recommendations are keyed to experts in higher education, right? But there's a lot of ELT practice that happens in K-12 schools, which I know relatively little about, right? So being able to give an idea that I have in my book to something like ChatGPT-4 and ask it a question like, how might this play out in K-12, or how might this be different in a K-12 setting, has been really helpful in me refining the product and helping to provide direction to future research that I need to do to fill in those gaps, right? And here again, the AI is acting in support of me and my existing or my emerging expertise. It's not a replacement for it, right? Indeed, all of the output from the AI can only be sort of rendered sensical, can only be verified through the lens of my expertise as an applied linguist, right? Without that expertise in place first, then it becomes a whole lot more difficult to do something meaningful with this tool, right?
But you've mentioned that you kind of lack this community vibe and having this springboard for your ideas, like your academic adversary. Would you say that in this case, Gen AI took somebody's job? away from them?
Not in the strictest sense of it being a job, because I don't have the funding to pay somebody to be that adversary for me, right? And I would say in this regards, it's created jobs, right? If you look at higher education, at least in the United States right now, we're entering the 2024, 2025 job cycle, right? So the job postings that will be 2024, 2025 academic year are starting to come online now. And we're seeing a huge number of positions in English departments and colleges of education focused on the intersection of education and artificial intelligence, or the intersection of artificial intelligence and the digital humanities, right? And these were jobs that may not have existed before, right? And these represent highly skilled labor, you know?
Yes.
The other thing then to keep in mind is there's been this worry then that as AI gets better at producing human-like outputs, well, we won't need the human beings, which is patently false. Because one of the things that we know from computer science is if you feed a large language model like GPT AI-produced text, over time it gets dumber, right? This is something called model collapse. You can't train AI on AI output. It needs human output. And so one of the things that we've seen recently is the emergence of AI training companies that are actually hiring technical writers and professional writers and creative writers and poets to produce new text to help train these systems, right? So we're again seeing a shift in the labor market and an increased value, I would say, in creative labor, right? Because we need it to help build these models and to build their capacity long term.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what Gen AI advocates say. That they, basically the bottom line is that they say, okay, some of the jobs will be redundant, but it's going to create a spectrum of other jobs, alternative jobs that are going to emerge on the labor market, right? So no worry, you're just going to have to kind of creatively adapt. As we said, adapting is the key skill at the moment, isn't it?
It is, and I would say that it also shifts how we create value around these different sort of productive tasks. You brought in the idea of the Industrial Revolution earlier, and this makes me think of one of my hobbies, which is sewing, right? Once upon a time, sewing would have been skilled labor, right? And it still is, but pre-Industrial Revolution, right, the number of individuals that might have had access to this skill might have been relatively limited. Right? It was oftentimes taught in the home and then monetized through sweatshops. Let's be honest about what that was, right? But then with the rise of automation, we then see the growth of skilled or semi-skilled positions for individuals who can either work alongside the machine or program the machine through things like punch cards or maintain the machine. And then that skill in sewing shifted to the home sewist, right? And now if we think about the value of the output from a mass-produced shirt like this at Old Navy, I could care less about it. But now if a home sewist creates a shirt for us, that shirt has increased personal value for us, right? And that comes through the fact that it was produced with human hands, that it was produced through human labor and human creativity, right? So we see a shift in how we value these everyday objects, right? So yes, the AI can serve as a stand-in for a conversation partner, but there's still intensely more human and social value in the human-human interaction, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
But barring the ability to engage in that human-human interaction, we have this other tool then that can support learners or support teachers in their moment of need.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, metaphorically, I guess we could say that a hand-sewed shirt is kind of imbued with soul, with passion, with emotions, right? Something that Gen AI can't actually give us. And there was this event that hit the headlines of don't remember where and when that happened. It was quite recently that a sermon in a church of whatever kind was delivered by an avatar. And while the sermon itself made perfect sense, so many people commented on it saying, it's devoid of soul. It's devoid of emotions. It's not persuasive. It's not, there is no excitement. There's no thrill there. Do you think that we're actually going to get to the point, in the foreseeable or not so foreseeable future, that Gen AI content is going to have this so?
So I'll say that from the perspective of computer science, this is the end goal, right? Because the end goal of artificial intelligence is that artificial general intelligence, so that the machine can engage in things like parsing human emotion and displaying human-like emotion, right? There's an entire subfield of computer sciences called affective computing, and this is what they do, right? They engage in computer vision systems and affective programs to be able to read human emotion, right? So that the machine can interact with the human more flawlessly, because human beings are inherently emotional creatures and we desire that emotional connection, right? Medium term, I would say this is something that we can see moving in that direction, right? So I mentioned earlier that GPT-4, which is the paid version of ChatGPT, excuse me, it's a more powerful language model. It can do more creative things, but they recently added voice to text to it. So you can talk to ChatGPT just like you can talk to a human being. And what's shocking is their ability to have coded the system with certain prosodic features. So it engages in things like back channeling. So you'll be talking, it'll be like, well, what I mean is, right? And it'll have these sort of false starts and these sort of hiccups, just like when you're talking to a human being, like you've noticed in my own speech today, right? As we're sort of spinning up our answer, right? It'll engage in these sort of clarifying sort of gestures, right? Which make it feel almost human-like, right? Because those are some of those sort of non-linguistic tools that we use, or non-language tools that we use to create that connection, right? So even that little tag right there, that felt like an inherently human sort of fingerprint, but now ChatGPT-4 can do this when you're talking to it, right? That being said, it's an imperfect system. It attempts to, leverage some of that affective computing to look at the text that it's producing to decide what the voice should sound like, and occasionally it over pitches the enthusiasm, right? So I was talking with ChatGPT-4 about another book chapter that I'm working on diversity, equity, and inclusion in times of radical change, right? Which is a necessarily sort of pessimistic topic at the moment here in the United States, right? And it was talking about this really serious idea of sort of ethical resistance, right? And halfway through one of its sentences, it was talking in this very measured sort of tone, explaining what it meant by ethical resistance. And then it hit one sentence where it was like overly cheery, but it was overly cheery about a really grim topic, right? Which kind of causes that facade to crack, right? So that's to say it's an imperfect technology, but we see the groundworks there already in some of the speech-to-text capabilities in OpenAI's GPT-4, for example, right? Now, as those technologies spread to other platforms like Google Bard or Claude Anthropic 2, it'll be interesting to see what happens, right?
Thank you for that. Yes,
yeah.
immensely interesting. Joshua, before we move on to practical applications of Gen AI within the classroom setting or within the language education context, can you give us, a brief kind of understanding what the difference between implementing AI and Gen AI is? You've already said that AI has been, an integral part of the EdTech sector for some time. How has it been implemented? In what areas of language learning and teaching have we already encountered it?
Yeah. So we first see the emergence of AI in education. Sometimes that's just called AIED in the 1980s, right? And this emerged through what were called intelligent tutoring systems. So these were computer programs that were hard-coded by the programmer with certain pedagogical strategies and certain domain knowledge that it would then present to the user. The user would interact with the system, and based on the responses from the user, the system would modify the instructional plan. These began as highly technical systems that would teach skills like HVAC repair. Right? So it would simulate an HVAC system, an HVAC system for the user. It would trigger a problem in the HVAC system, and the user would then have to troubleshoot and repair it on the computer screen, right?
Mm.
But there was AI powering that underneath that was watching the inputs from the users and deciding what appropriate next steps would be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it triggered a fault in a fuse, for example, and the user, instead of going and checking the fuses from step one, instead was checking the wall plug to make sure that the HVA system was plugged in, it may prompt the user of, hey, this kind of fault is typically indicative of a fuse fault, so check the fuse box first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then the next time that the user engages with that system, it would trigger a similar fault to engage in some reinforcement learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And intelligent tutoring systems were kind of the dominant way that we saw AI in education throughout much of the 90s and the early 2000s. A really popular example of this is Duolingo. Right? Duolingo, for example, has been AI powered since I think 2013, 2014. And what the AI is doing there is monitoring user progress through lessons and creating a more individualized learning plan.
Right.
And that's been sort of the primary way that we've seen AI systems deployed in education, was to help personalize learning for students. Which certainly an expert teacher can do, but an expert teacher doing this for 30, 40, 60 students becomes a Herculean task as far as time and energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the AI systems have helped take some of that administrative work away from the educator so that they can focus more on what's happening in the classroom and working one-to-one with students, which the AI can't replace.
Mm-hmm.
The other way that we've seen AI in education through much of the early 2000s and up to today have been through classroom management platforms and the use of predictive analytics, right? So as we've gathered more and more data about our students, we've used AI-powered systems to help do things like recommend remedial plans if students aren't coming to classes, right? Or to connect parental resources with community resources to help facilitate student learning and success. That's been sort of the dominant way that we've seen it used up until the advent of generative AI and its sort of release to the public, which has led to this sort of existential moment across numerous disciplines and not just education of, well, what the devil do we do with this now? And what do we still need human beings for, right? And that's kind of the moment that we're at right now, is saying, okay, well, now we have this shockingly easy to use, seemingly powerful tool. So what's the next step for it? And what's the next step for us as users of this tool and as human beings that have to exist in a society alongside of now these machine agents, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we talk about Gen AI and its implementation at the moment, you know, I've been stalking your activity on LinkedIn for some time now, and I've seen that you've done a lot of online courses, you know, as far as Google's Bard is concerned, and all of the other Gen AI models. Do you think it's necessary for teachers to engage in this, you know, continuous education activity, like, you know, embracing AI, but also from the technical angle? Or can it be actually deployed for teaching and teaching languages in particular without that expert knowledge?
Right. So before we got started, I had mentioned to you that I was starting a new master's in applied computer sciences. No, I don't think every teacher is going to need to get a master's in applied computer science. Just the super nerds like me, right? And I'll be honest, the transition to computer sciences came at a professional moment when I was considering whether or not I wanted to stay in education, right? And then Gen AI happened, and it just happened to be this sort of natural synergy between my past as an educator and my future in computer sciences. But I don't think every educator needs that, right? What every educator is going to need, though, is a baseline of critical AI literacy where they understand what the tools are, the basic underlying principles of how they work, so that they can understand their potential strengths and limitations, right? And how these tools can be used to support their learning, or to support their work in the classroom, or to support student learning, or how they can create classroom spaces that disengage from these technologies if they so choose, right? But this requires that sort of baseline critical AI literacy. Part of this then is also the ability to engage with either text or video or sound, right? And make a qualified judgment as to whether what you're looking at is human generated, AI generated, or a mix of the two, right? Which we've seen some impressive things done with Gen AI and really good prompt engineering. It's hard to tell, right?
What would you say that prompt engineering is yet another, we had this webinar last week with Mike Mayer of Pearson Languages, and what he said, what's was particularly striking for me was that knowledge is no longer at a premium, it's skills. And when I think about prompt engineering, would you say that it's yet another skill that we need to acquire in order to be able to perform our jobs as teachers, as students to the fullest?
I would say so. And the reason that I would say that is because, as I was explaining to some of the student teachers that I work with at Montgomery College recently, these are garbage in, garbage out systems. If the prompt that you give the system is trash, then of course, the response that you get from it is going to be equally useless to you, and you're not going to see the value in that system. Right? So I mentioned earlier that I was using GPT-4 to help me sort of think through today, because this is the first time I've done a podcast like this before. It was a new experience, and we all know that educators don't like surprises, right? If I had just told it, pretend you're a podcast host interviewing me, then it may have asked completely unrelated questions. It might have asked me about baking. We don't know, but that would have been my fault because I gave it a garbage prompt, right? I didn't provide it with rich context about what I needed from it, right? And that's what prompt engineering is. It's about creating that rich context for the system so it knows what that output should look like. But yeah, that does become a critical skill, and it becomes a critical skill for learners too, because there are ways to engage with these AI systems that shortchange the learning process and lead to learning loss, and that's a legitimate concern, and that's what we want to avoid, right? So just very quickly, I am a humanities person, right? My PhD is in applied linguistics. That was on purpose. When I started my bachelor's, I started in computer sciences. I couldn't hack it, and I stayed away from it for 18 years, right? It was just post-pandemic and needing something new and being married to a software engineer that they were like, hey, you should try computer programming classes. And now I'm stubborn enough to be like, okay, sure, I'll do it. But as a person who identifies as a humanities person and not a STEM person, computer programming classes are tough. They're tough for me, right? Getting in this sort of mindset, this shift from the deep sort of problematizing analytic mind to the more algorithmic mind is a challenge for me, right? And there are ways that I can engage with AI as a student of computer programming that support my learning, and ways that I can engage with it that shortchange that learning, right? AI tools right now like ChatGPT-4 and Google Bard are surprisingly good at entry-level programming, which is the kind of stuff I'm doing right now. So if I just say, hey, I'm working on a project to design an e-commerce platform, it will just try to be helpful and spit out the code, but that doesn't help me learn, right? If, however, I tell it, I want you to act as my teaching assistant in this web development class, and I want to be able to tell you my plan for this website, and I want you to give me hints about what my next step should be. That's a far better use of that tool as a student, right? That helps me use that tool in a way that facilitates my learning of this new skill, right? But that again comes down to a difference in prompt, right? Help me do this thing versus take on this role as my teaching assistant, and here's what I want your outputs to be like. That's what we're talking about with prompt engineering, and it leads to different outcomes for the learner using it as a tool, right?
Yes. And yes, you've kind of, given us a glimpse into what ethical use of Gen AI is, right? Instead of getting the code generated for yourself, you're asking this large language model to help you understanding how to do that, how to achieve your aim, right? Moving to our next question, Joshua. I think that in recent months, we've observed a mushrooming of podcasts, webinars, websites for educators of all sorts on how to implement Gen AI into that teaching. So we've had EdTech conference devoted to AI. There's business English language EdTech conference taking place in Stuttgart. I'm going to be attending that, by the way, in a couple of weeks' time. And there's lots and lots of content and presentations on, the use of Gen AI and AI. Surprisingly, in language education, especially English language education. So Gen AI scientists, that they promise us that this large language model is going to free us from mundane, down to earth, repetitive, tedious work. Right? In what ways? Can you give us, your pro tips on implementing Gen AI into English language teaching or language teaching, for that matter?
Sure. Here I would say, looking at it from the lens of the educator, start with just sort of low stakes play, right? So carve out some time, find a tool that you want to engage with, whether that's GPT 3.5 or Google Bard, right? Or Anthropic's Claude 2, whichever, right? And find ways to experiment with it as part of your labor process, right? So one thing that was, for me, kind of surprisingly transformative was, I can write the announcements that go on my CMS. I've been doing it for 10 plus years, right? But I've always been writing those announcements kind of for me, right? The way that the announcement would make sense to me, which was largely a text-heavy email, which isn't the way that students engage with digital text, right? Especially young students. So just out of a moment of curiosity, I went to ChatGPT. I gave it my announcement. I said, hey, I teach mostly 18-year-olds, some of whom are either high functioning on the autistic spectrum, right? Or they have ADHD, right? How can I recraft these announcements to be more accessible to them, right? And it gave me a new format for my announcements that I still use today that resonate really well with students, because it makes additional use of formatting to draw attention. It's restructured sort of the flow of information, right? From the most important to the least important. And it's incorporated the use of things like icons so that students have that sort of visual cue, right? I've been teaching for 10 plus years, and that thought just wouldn't have occurred to me, because in my mind, it's an announcement on a Blackboard system. It's fine if it looks like an email, because that's the way my professors gave me the announcement. So just kind of that sort of low stakes play. The other thing that I would say that as the educator you can do is find that lesson that you're not happy with. And I think if you're an honest educator, you know what lesson that is, right? You give it once a year and you're like, didn't quite work, right? Pass that lesson or that lesson plan through something like Google Bard and ask it to be a critical evaluator. Ask it to give you ideas for how you can refine that to work with Gen Z students, for example, right? Or what changes you might need to make to that lesson to make it more appealing to adult learners, right? And try to find ways to play with these tools in support of your expertise, right? With students, I would say it comes to creating space for them to either engage with the tool in the safety of the classroom, right? Or to even push back against the tool, right? So something like language, we've talked a lot about writing, and certainly there are ways that we can show our students to use AI as a sort of peer review buddy, right? By giving them, for example, a worksheet that has prompts already written for them, saying, okay, what I want you to do then is take the introduction for your paper, give the AI this prompt, and then this part of your introduction, and then this prompt, and then this part of your introduction, and see what the output is and see if that helps you revise it, right? And then pair that with in-class workshopping as well and be like, okay, well, where did the useful information come from? How do we need to change these prompts so that we get something a little bit closer to more useful for you as a learner, right? So creating space to engage with those tools, right? I'd say the final part of this then is institutionally. The most powerful AI models are subscription-based, which means institutions, just like some have started paying for things like Grammarly, which is a constructive AI that does revision and editing, right? If this tool is something that can help enough learners, then perhaps this is something institutions need to start to value and provide to their learners. Because GPT-4 with the talk to text, it's it's multilingual. It will default to spitting out in English, but I was having a conversation with it and I got bored, so I started talking to it in Chinese. And it responded in competent, passable Chinese as far as my my high intermediate language proficiency could tell me, right? So this is a tool that can now, at the paid model at least, also support things like listening and speaking practice, and can support it in more than English, right? It can support it in Japanese, Chinese, I've tried. My Spanish is too broken, so I couldn't do a good test of that one, but there's value in this tool, right? And there are different ways that it can then be either made available or facilitated for learners or facilitated for educators.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you kind of, alluded to the question posed by Matthew, who's asking us who's asking you, what's your opinion on AI in translation, and whether it's going to impact the translation industry? If yes, in what way?
Yeah. I would say that it already has, right? Because Google Translate, most machine translators have been powered by AI and increasingly large language models on the back end for a long time now, right? I would say that the way that we're going to see this change going forward is that these systems will be able to produce more authentic outputs. They'll be able to navigate that transition between languages and cultures a little bit more fluently, and this is going to come down to the training data that they're provided with, right? The way machine translation used to work at the very beginning was off of a sort of n-gram model, so it was looking at first word by word, which is why the translation sucked, right? But then as that n-gram window, the number of words it could consider at once grew, the translation became better, right? The next component of that then is to start to consider the cultural and the affective element behind these words, the illocutionary force, right? And this is where advances in affective computing can potentially come into play, right? If we start to use affective computing and a multilingual data set to train future machine translation systems, this can lead to potentially more robust outputs, right? Now, that being said, the output of the machine translator is only going to be as good as the underlying language model, right? So for this, I pull people's attention to GPT 3.5 versus GPT 4, right? A lot of people who look at early ChatGPT output are like, this feels kind of soulless and artificial, right? Part of that's your prompt. Part of that's the fact that GPT 3.5 has a shorter working memory, right? It has a smaller context window, so it can only work in smaller bouts of text, about 3,000 words, I think, right? GPT-4, however, is a much more powerful language model. It was trained on a larger training data set. It has a larger context window, so it has a larger sort of working memory at formulating its responses, and it can go into a shocking amount of detail and creativity, right? So the more powerful the underlying model, the more sort of robust and useful that output is going to be, which I think is the direction we're going to see with machine translation going forward, especially if the computer science people continue to listen to us humanities people and tell them that there is value in multilingual, multi-rhetorical text and in training AI systems to work with these kind of texts so that they can help navigate that space, right? And hopefully this will continue to democratize translation and make it easier for individuals to work across languages and cultures in ways that they may not have been able to before, right? That being said, there's still space for the professional translator. There's still space for the professional interpreter. It's just that that space may shift in the future to helping technology firms build out this technology more robustly, or helping business professionals learn how to incorporate these tools more effectively into their workflows, right?
Yeah, which again brings us to the question of being able to adapt oneself to the recent developments in Gen AI, and the sooner we do it, the better for us and for our careers and whatnot, right? So Joshua, we've got yet another question from one of our audience, and Łukasz says, AI is now being used to evaluate students' English language proficiency. and is being advertised as a more objective tool when comparing to human evaluators. What's your take on that?
My take is yes and no. So we talked about AI ethics, and a more serious part of this is this idea of algorithmic fairness or algorithmic bias, right? Said another way, when we look at machine systems, there's this temptation to view them as inherently more objective than human beings because they're robots, they're machines, they're silicon and electricity, and that's simply not the case, right? AI systems inherit the biases of the people programming them, right? And we only need to look to Google's horrific missteps with computer vision and facial recognition in 2014 to see this, right? So if you're not familiar with this, Google was training facial recognition systems in the early 2010s, and the system consistently miscategorized individuals with darker skin tones as gorillas, right? And this is because the training data that they used to train the model, the only things in that training data with darker skin tones were gorillas and monkeys. If we consider the fact that most of the planet has darker skin tone than you and I, this is problematic, right? But because that AI system had been trained predominantly on white and lighter skin tone faces, it just learned lighter skin tones are humans, darker skin tones are gorillas.
As you're saying, garbage in and garbage out.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. So it very much goes into the quality of the training data, right? Beyond that, though, once the problem is identified, we then have to ask, well, what are tech companies doing to address this? Google's response was just to make it so the system could identify nothing as a gorilla, which does not fix the underlying bias, right? So I give this example to show if we were to create an AI essay grader, for example, and we only used monolingual North American A+ student papers to train that system, then it would be inherently biased against multilingual writers or non-North American writers, right? So again, garbage in, garbage out. And this is why, especially in educational interventions, there always has to be a human being in the loop. So certainly, I believe we can use AI tools to help increase objectivity, to act as a second set of eyes, but there needs to be an expert human assessor at the very least reviewing that output and able to challenge it when necessary, right? That being said, I've played with GPT-4, which isn't trained in essay assessment, and I've given it the prompt to an essay that I've given my students. I've given it a rubric. I've shown it then examples of A paper, B paper, C paper, right? And through all of this, I'm engaging that prompt engineering. I'm saying, hey, you're my teaching assistant. I'm teaching you how to grade papers. So here are some things that you need to keep in mind, right? And then I passed it a sample student paper, and its score was within a margin of error of my own score for that paper, right? I think it even scored it more generously than I did. I think it gave the paper a 92 and I gave it an 87, right? So again, through careful prompt engineering, there is the ability for these systems to streamline that labor, right? For the educator, because something like assessment it's high stakes for the student. There's a heavy emotional component in it, right? So anything that we can do to help increase this sort of objective assessment, I think, can be seen as a value for the student. But it can't be wholly automated to the point that we can remove the teacher or the human being from the loop entirely, because that teacher brings with them intense institutional and personal knowledge about that student, about that class, that informs that sort of grading process, right? And again, there is the need, if we're using AI to evaluate humans, then to really start to dig into this question of algorithmic fairness and potential biases in the underlying model, and to address those proactively.
Right, you were saying about this, these two strands of academia coming together in pursuit of a fairer, more just, more democratic Gen AI. Do you see it happening in your own academic context?
I have hopes. And the reason why I say that is, again, because I work occasionally with grad students, I keep my fingers on the pulse of the job market. And we've seen more institutions in the United States looking for professors that can bridge that gap between computer science and education, or between computer science and English studies. Shockingly, Iowa is emerging as a sort of hub in the US right now.
Why is it shocking?
I guess because it's the Midwest and it's not part of Silicon Valley. Right? Because when you think of EdTech and AI, you start to think of places like Stanford and Harvard and MIT. But both
Iowa, yeah.
But both Iowa State University and a couple of small liberal arts schools like Drake University out in Iowa are both building up robust interdisciplinary AI programs, right? To train not just future AI developers, but also to train future linguists and translators and how to ethically engage with AI tools and to be part of that development process in a way that they haven't been before. Right?
Absolutely. Joshua, we have to be mindful of our time. I think that, yes, I think that this conversation could, could go over and over, and
yeah, there's definitely a lot to dig into.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the time and your expertise that you were willing to share with us. And I do think that we can finish this episode on a very positive note. That Gen AI is something that we shouldn't be anxious of. That's that's something that we should be embracing, and we should be collaborating with. We should be treating it as our colleague, perhaps not a friend, an acquaintance.
Thank you. I wouldn't use it necessarily to troubleshoot my marriage or sibling squabbles, but I would definitely use it to help me plan a vacation or a lesson plan. And I think it'd be surprisingly useful in that regard.
Joshua, once again, thank you so much. Have a lovely Friday and a great weekend. And yeah, I hope to stay in touch. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Bye.
I'll see you around.